Have you ever walked into a room and within seconds, you knew exactly how everyone was feeling? Not because anyone said a word, not because you could read minds, but because you noticed what everyone else ignored: the silence between sentences, the smile that didn't reach the eyes, the hesitation before someone answered, the invisible weight people carry when they think no one is paying attention. If that's you, then listen carefully, because what most people call loneliness may actually be something very different. The world often celebrates people with the biggest voices, but it quietly overlooks the people with the deepest awareness. Those who feel everything, those who notice everything, those who absorb emotions like a sponge absorbs water. And here's the strange part: many of these people end up with very few friends. Not because they're unlikable, not because they're antisocial, but because they experience human connection on a completely different level. When you can sense hidden intentions, when you recognize emotional patterns before anyone speaks, when you instinctively know when someone's words and actions don't match, your standards for relationships change forever. You stop chasing crowds. You stop begging for acceptance. You stop confusing attention with connection, and that's when something powerful begins to happen. You realize that solitude is not always a punishment. Sometimes it's protection. Because every person you allow into your life influences your energy, your confidence, your decisions, and ultimately your future. The people who understand this become incredibly selective, not out of arrogance, but out of self-respect. Today's journey isn't about why empaths are lonely. It's about why some of the most emotionally intelligent people intentionally choose a smaller circle. By the end of this video, you'll discover 9 powerful secrets that quietly shape the lives of people who value depth over popularity, authenticity over approval, and peace over constant noise. Some of these truths may challenge the way you've always viewed friendship. Others may explain feelings you've carried for years but could never put into words. So, as we begin, ask yourself one simple question: are you truly alone, or have you simply outgrown relationships that no longer align with who you're becoming? Let's uncover the 9 secrets. One of the biggest misunderstandings about highly empathetic people is that others assume they are paying attention only to emotions. In reality, they are paying attention to patterns. Anyone can believe a promise once. Almost anyone can overlook a single mistake. But when the same behavior repeats itself in different forms, an empath begins to connect the dots. They aren't searching for perfection, and they aren't expecting people to get everything right. What they are looking for is consistency. They quietly observe whether your actions reflect your words, whether your intentions stay the same when circumstances change, and whether the version of yourself you present to the world is the same one that appears behind closed doors. Most people think trust is built through impressive speeches or grand gestures. It isn't. Trust is built in the smallest moments that most people forget within minutes. It's built when someone keeps a simple promise without being reminded. It's built when someone says they'll be there and actually shows up. It's built when respect remains present even during disagreement. These moments may seem insignificant on their own, but together they form a pattern. And patterns are difficult to fake for very long. The interesting thing is that people who rely on appearances usually believe they are convincing everyone around them. They assume that confidence, charm, or clever words are enough to shape how others see them. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it works surprisingly well. But genuine awareness isn't easily distracted by polished conversations. It quietly asks a different question. Not, what did this person say? But, what did this person consistently do? That single question changes everything. Imagine someone who constantly tells you that honesty is the most important value in their life. They speak passionately about loyalty, integrity, and respect. On the surface, everything sounds convincing. But over time, you notice small contradictions. They exaggerate stories to impress people. They avoid taking responsibility when something goes wrong. They criticize others for behavior they excuse in themselves. None of these moments alone may seem dramatic, yet together, they begin to reveal something much more important than any speech ever could. They reveal a pattern. This is where many relationships quietly begin to change. Not because of one argument, Not because of one misunderstanding, but because repeated inconsistencies slowly replace certainty with doubt. Every contradiction adds another small crack to the foundation. Eventually, the foundation becomes too weak to support genuine trust. What's fascinating is that an empath often won't point this out immediately. They are usually patient. They give people the benefit of the doubt. They understand that everyone has difficult days and moments of weakness. They know that life is complicated and that no one behaves perfectly all the time. Instead of rushing to judgment, they observe. They wait. They watch to see whether the inconsistency is temporary or whether it becomes part of someone's character. That patience is frequently misunderstood as ignorance. Someone may assume they didn't notice. In reality, they noticed everything. They simply chose not to react immediately because they value understanding more than impulsive conclusions. Silence should never be mistaken for blindness. Often, silence is simply observation in progress. Over time, observation becomes clarity. Clarity changes the way people interact. Conversations become shorter. Expectations become lower. Emotional investment slowly decreases. There may not be dramatic confrontations or emotional scenes. There doesn't have to be. Once enough evidence accumulates, the decision begins forming quietly beneath the surface. Not out of anger, but out of recognition. Many people expect conflict to arrive with raised voices. They assume the end of trust should sound loud. Yet some of life's most important decisions happen in complete silence. A person can stop believing someone long before they stop talking to them. They can stop feeling emotionally safe long before the relationship officially ends. The outside appears unchanged while the inside has already begun moving in a different direction. Another reason patterns matter so much is because they reveal priorities. People always make time for what truly matters to them. They always reveal their values through repeated behavior. Words may describe intentions, but habits reveal commitment. This is why consistency carries so much weight. It removes uncertainty. It allows another person to relax because they know what to expect. Predictability in character creates emotional safety. Emotional safety is one of the rarest qualities in any relationship. It doesn't come from never making mistakes. It comes from knowing that mistakes will be acknowledged honestly, repaired sincerely, and learned from willingly. That process strengthens trust instead of weakening it. But when excuses become more common than accountability, the opposite happens. Doubt grows stronger than confidence. Think about how people build reputations. They don't earn them through one extraordinary day. They earn them through ordinary days repeated hundreds of times. Character is not a performance delivered under perfect conditions. Character is the collection of choices made when no one is watching, when recognition isn't guaranteed, and when honesty is less convenient than deception. People with strong emotional awareness often understand this instinctively. They recognize that consistency requires discipline. It requires authenticity. Anyone can act differently for a few hours or even a few weeks. Maintaining integrity over months and years is far more difficult. That's why repeated behavior becomes the most reliable source of information. Perhaps the greatest lesson here is that trust doesn't usually disappear overnight. It fades quietly, one inconsistency at a time, a forgotten promise, an unnecessary lie, a repeated excuse, a moment of disrespect disguised as a joke. Each event may seem too small to matter on its own, yet together they tell a story that becomes impossible to ignore. And once someone has seen that story clearly, they rarely need another explanation. They don't leave because of a single sentence or a single mistake. They leave because the pattern has answered every question they once hoped would have a different ending. At that point, silence isn't a punishment, and distance isn't revenge. It's simply the natural result of recognizing that genuine connection can only exist where words and actions continue to move in the same direction. One of the greatest misconceptions about deeply empathetic people is that their kindness has no limits. From the outside, it can certainly look that way. They forgive more than most people. They listen when others have stopped listening. They offer second chances, third chances, and sometimes even more. Because of this, many people assume they will always be there, no matter how they are treated. What they fail to understand is that empathy is not the absence of boundaries. In fact, some of the strongest boundaries are built by people who have spent years giving too much of themselves. An empathetic person rarely walks away because of a single disagreement or an isolated mistake. They understand that everyone has difficult moments. They know that stress, fear, disappointment, and insecurity can bring out the worst in anyone. Instead of reacting immediately, they often try to understand what caused the behavior. They ask themselves whether someone is hurting, overwhelmed, or struggling with something they cannot see. Their first instinct is usually compassion rather than judgment. But compassion has a limit when it is met with repeated disrespect. There is an important difference between making a mistake and creating a pattern. A mistake is followed by accountability, growth, and change. A pattern repeats itself despite conversations, apologies, and promises. That difference is impossible to ignore forever. Eventually, even the most patient person begins to recognize that understanding someone's reasons does not erase the impact of their actions. This is where many relationships quietly begin to change. Imagine carrying the emotional weight of every conversation. Imagine being the one who always checks in first, always remembers important dates, always notices when someone is struggling, always makes the effort to repair misunderstandings. At first, it feels natural. Helping others feels meaningful. But over time, if that care is never returned, something begins to shift inside. The relationship starts to feel less like a connection and more like a responsibility. That feeling doesn't appear overnight. It grows slowly through dozens of small experiences. A message ignored until someone needs a favor, a personal boundary dismissed as unimportant, feelings laughed off instead of respected, honest conversations turned into arguments, genuine concerns labeled as being too sensitive. None of these moments may seem dramatic by themselves, yet together, they create a powerful message. They communicate that one person's emotional well-being matters less than the other's convenience. People often underestimate the damage caused by emotional dismissal. They believe that if there are no visible wounds, then no real harm has been done. But emotional disrespect leaves its mark in quieter ways. It teaches someone that their thoughts are unwelcome. Their feelings are inconvenient. Their honesty creates problems instead of solutions. Eventually, they stop sharing the parts of themselves that once made the relationship genuine. Silence begins to replace openness. Distance begins to replace closeness, not because they have stopped caring, but because they have realized that caring alone cannot sustain a healthy relationship. Another behavior that slowly pushes empathetic people away is manipulation disguised as affection. Sometimes it appears as guilt. Sometimes it appears as constant emotional pressure. Sometimes it appears as making someone feel responsible for another person's happiness. These tactics are often subtle enough that outsiders never notice them. But someone who pays close attention to emotional dynamics eventually recognizes the difference between love and control. Healthy relationships allow people to make choices freely. Manipulative relationships make people feel guilty for making those same choices. The difference is enormous. When every decision requires emotional negotiation, exhaustion becomes inevitable. An empathetic person may spend months trying to avoid conflict, trying to explain themselves more clearly, trying to meet expectations that constantly change. Yet no amount of effort can satisfy someone who benefits from keeping another person emotionally off balance. Eventually, they stop trying, not because they stopped caring, because they finally realized the rules were never designed to be fair. There is another form of disrespect that often goes unnoticed. It happens when someone's kindness is treated as weakness. Some people mistake patience for passivity. They assume that because someone remains calm, they lack strength. They believe they can continue crossing boundaries without consequences because there has never been an explosive reaction. But quiet people often make quiet decisions. While others are focused on winning arguments, they are evaluating the future of the relationship. While someone else believes everything has returned to normal, they are paying attention to whether anything has actually changed. Their silence is not surrender. It is observation. This surprises many people. They expect warnings. They expect dramatic confrontations. Instead, they receive distance. By the time they realize something has changed, the emotional connection has already faded. Respect is one of those things that rarely disappears all at once. It erodes through repetition, repeated criticism, repeated dishonesty, repeated broken promises, repeated moments where one person's needs are consistently placed above the others. Every repetition quietly reinforces the same conclusion: this relationship is no longer balanced. Balance matters more than perfection. No healthy relationship consists of one person always giving while the other always receives. There are seasons when one person carries more weight than the other, and that is completely normal. Life changes. Circumstances change. People need support at different times. But over the long term, genuine relationships naturally move toward reciprocity. Care flows in both directions. Effort is shared. Respect remains consistent even during disagreement. When that balance disappears, emotional fatigue begins to replace emotional fulfillment. Many people focus only on what they say. They overlook what they repeatedly communicate through their behavior. Every ignored boundary sends a message. Every dismissed concern sends a message. Every sarcastic comment disguised as humor sends a message. Every promise that goes unfulfilled sends a message. Eventually, those messages become louder than any apology. That is why repeated emotional disrespect is so powerful. It changes how someone feels, not just what they think. Once a person no longer feels emotionally safe, rebuilding trust becomes significantly more difficult. Trust cannot survive on words alone. It depends on consistent behavior over time. Perhaps the most surprising part is that an empathetic person often leaves without resentment. They do not always seek revenge or closure. They simply recognize that continuing to remain where respect is absent would require abandoning their own well-being. They understand that protecting their peace is not selfish. It is necessary. Choosing distance is sometimes the most compassionate decision they can make, not only for themselves but for the relationship itself. It prevents bitterness from replacing kindness. It prevents constant conflict from replacing meaningful conversation. It acknowledges a simple truth that many people spend years avoiding: no amount of empathy can heal a relationship in which only one person is committed to mutual respect. And that realization changes everything. From that moment forward, they stop trying to convince others to value them. They stop negotiating for basic respect. They stop explaining boundaries that have already been ignored. Instead, they quietly invest their energy where kindness is appreciated, honesty is welcomed, and respect is returned as naturally as it is given. One of the most confusing experiences for people is when someone they believed would always stay suddenly disappears from their life. Calls become less frequent. Messages grow shorter. Invitations are politely declined. Eventually, the silence becomes permanent. To the outside observer, it can feel abrupt, almost as if the relationship ended without warning. But for a deeply empathetic person, that final decision is rarely spontaneous. It is usually the last step in a long journey that no one else ever noticed. Many empathetic people have a habit of giving others the benefit of the doubt. When someone disappoints them, they rarely assume the worst immediately. Instead, they begin searching for explanations. Maybe that person is under stress. Maybe they're dealing with personal challenges. Maybe they didn't realize the impact of their words. Instead of reacting to the first disappointment, they choose understanding. Instead of closing the door, they leave it open a little longer. This willingness to understand can easily be mistaken for endless tolerance. Others may believe everything is fine simply because no argument has taken place. They assume silence means forgiveness and patience means acceptance. What they don't realize is that an empathetic person is paying close attention not only to what happened once, but to whether anything truly changes afterward. Every meaningful relationship depends on growth. Mistakes happen in every friendship, every family, and every partnership. What determines the future is not the mistake itself, but the response that follows. Does the person acknowledge the hurt they caused? Do they make a sincere effort to improve? Do their actions begin to reflect their promises? These questions quietly shape every future interaction. An empathetic person often waits much longer than most people would. They continue investing time, energy, and hope because they believe people are capable of change. They remember the good moments. They remember the potential they once saw. They hold on to the possibility that tomorrow may look different from yesterday. Hope is a beautiful quality, but hope without change eventually becomes exhaustion. There comes a point where every conversation begins to sound familiar. The apologies become predictable. The explanations repeat themselves. The promises are almost identical to the ones made months earlier, yet the behavior remains the same. This repetition slowly transforms optimism into clarity. One of the quietest forms of emotional pain is realizing that someone listens to your words but never allows them to influence their behavior. You explain how something affects you. They appear to understand. They even agree that things should improve. For a short time, everything seems different. Then life returns to exactly the way it was before. This cycle is incredibly difficult because it creates temporary hope over and over again. Each improvement raises expectations, only to have those expectations broken once more. Over time, disappointment becomes heavier than optimism. What many people never see is the internal conversation taking place during this period. An empathetic person asks themselves difficult questions. Am I expecting too much? Have I explained myself clearly enough? Am I being patient enough? Is this relationship worth another chance? They often examine their own actions before questioning anyone else's. That habit makes them remarkably compassionate. It also means they frequently carry burdens that were never theirs to begin with. Instead of immediately blaming others, they search for ways to repair the relationship themselves. They communicate more carefully. They become more understanding. They compromise more often. They adjust their expectations. They invest additional emotional energy in hopes of creating a healthier connection. But no relationship can thrive when only one person is responsible for its growth. Eventually, a quiet realization begins to take shape. The problem is no longer a lack of communication. It is no longer a misunderstanding. It is no longer uncertainty. The issue is that effort has become one-sided. That realization changes everything. When someone recognizes that they have spent months or even years trying to preserve a relationship alone, something shifts inside them. They stop focusing on what the relationship could become and begin accepting what it already is. Acceptance is often far more powerful than emotion because it replaces wishful thinking with reality. This is why their departure feels sudden to everyone except themselves. While others believed everything was continuing as usual, they had already been processing disappointment for a very long time. Every ignored conversation, every repeated pattern, every broken commitment had quietly contributed to a decision that was forming beneath the surface. By the time they finally step away, they are not reacting to one final incident. They are responding to the accumulated weight of everything that came before it. People often search for a dramatic explanation. They want to identify the exact sentence or the exact argument that ended the relationship. Yet meaningful endings rarely work that way. More often, they resemble a glass slowly filling with water. Each disappointment adds another drop. For a while, nothing appears different. Then eventually, one final drop causes the glass to overflow. It is tempting to blame the last drop, but the truth is that every previous drop mattered just as much. Another reason these departures seem unexpected is that empathetic people often avoid unnecessary conflict. They understand that winning arguments does not always solve problems. They prefer conversations that lead to understanding rather than confrontation. If repeated discussions have produced no lasting change, they may conclude that continuing the same conversation will only create more frustration. Instead of raising their voice, they begin protecting their peace. Protection does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like answering less frequently. Sometimes it looks like declining invitations. Sometimes it looks like investing energy elsewhere. Sometimes it simply looks like choosing silence over another exhausting explanation. To someone on the outside, these choices may appear cold. In reality, they are often the result of emotional fatigue rather than anger. There is an important difference between giving up on a person and giving up on a pattern that refuses to change. An empathetic person rarely stops caring overnight. Caring is usually the last thing to disappear. Long after trust has weakened, compassion often remains. They may still wish the other person well. They may still hope life becomes easier for them. They simply recognize that wishing someone well does not require remaining in a relationship that consistently damages their own well-being. That distinction is incredibly important. Walking away is not always an act of rejection. Sometimes it is an act of self-respect. It is the recognition that kindness should not require constant sacrifice, that loyalty should not demand endless emotional depletion, and that love, friendship, or family cannot flourish where effort travels in only one direction. When they finally disappear, it is rarely because they stopped valuing the relationship. It is because they reached the painful understanding that valuing a relationship cannot replace the shared responsibility required to sustain one. They had already offered patience, communication, forgiveness, and countless opportunities for change. The quiet departure simply reflected the conclusion they had been approaching all along. For those left wondering why the silence arrived without warning, the answer often lies not in the final goodbye, but in every quiet moment before it. Moments when understanding was offered, honesty was shared, boundaries were expressed, and hope was extended again and again. By the time the door finally closed, the decision had already been made through months of reflection, careful observation, and the difficult acceptance that some relationships cannot be saved by one person's effort alone. So, if there's one lesson to take away from everything we've explored today, it's this: the people who care the deepest don't usually leave first. They stay. They listen. They forgive. They hope. They give chances that most people never even realize they're receiving. But every chance carries a silent question. Is anything actually changing? When that question keeps being answered with the same painful pattern, something begins to shift. Not all at once, not dramatically, quietly. They stop expecting. They stop chasing. They stop explaining. And eventually, they stop returning. By the time their absence is finally noticed, they have already made peace with the decision. Their silence isn't meant to hurt anyone. It simply reflects the understanding that some relationships can only survive when respect, honesty, and effort flow in both directions. So before assuming that someone will always be there because they've always been kind, ask yourself something important. Do they feel appreciated or merely expected? Do they feel heard or simply tolerated? Do your actions consistently show the value they hold in your life, or have your words been doing all the work? Sometimes the strongest relationships aren't built through extraordinary moments. They're built through ordinary acts of consistency, respect, and genuine care repeated every single day. And sometimes the greatest loss isn't when someone walks away. It's realizing they were quietly drifting away while you believed everything was perfectly fine. If this message made you stop and reflect, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever walked away from a relationship after giving it every chance you could? Or have you realized too late that someone important was silently asking for the respect they deserved? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If you enjoyed this video and want more insights into human behavior, emotional intelligence, and building stronger relationships, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Because sometimes the smallest shifts in understanding create the biggest changes in the way we live, connect, and grow. And the next insight might completely change the way you see the people around you and yourself.